Hello listeners, and thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. Today we're going to be doing an interview with a lady called Sharron, and we're going to be talking about supplier evaluation. So firstly, Sharron, thank you very much for sparing the time. I know you're very busy. And while we just sort of set the scene, if you could just let the listeners know, please, a little bit about yourself and your roles and your experience, please.
Yeah, hi Katie. Really happy to be here today. So my name's Sharron. I am the Deputy Director of Procurement for the local NHS area. I've worked for them for just under a year now, so it's mainly public sector work that I carry out. Prior to that, I've got about 20 years experience of procurement in a variety of sectors. So I've worked in healthcare, pharmaceuticals, automotive, and done a variety of roles for both direct procurement and indirect procurement. So hopefully today, when we're talking about the subject, I can give lots of ideas from both public and private sector to help the listeners.
Oh, that sounds great. So yeah, certainly a wealth and breadth of experience there. So I look forward to finding out what you're going to be sharing with us. So just to get us going then, what I believe, and feel free at any point to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most people in procurement and in business have an understanding that not all suppliers are a good match for all buying organisations, and not necessarily all suppliers are able to provide all products. But from your experience, could you possibly tell the listeners what key areas you consider important when you evaluate a supplier to try and establish the best matches?
Absolutely. So when you are evaluating a supplier, there are lots of considerations that you have to think about. And also, it's a really important point that these are going to vary depending on the purchase that you are making. So as you know, from a procurement perspective, we purchase a wide variety of items. So it could be capital equipment, it could be services, it could be direct items, it could be MRO spares, it could be stationery. Depending on what it is you're buying is going to depend on whether you really need to do any kind of evaluating, or whether those suppliers are going to be quite generic, or whether you need to go into a lot of detail. So a lot of the time you would probably use some kind of theory like the Kraljic matrix to decide whether the spend is going to be very strategic. Therefore, if you're spending a lot of money on it and it's a very critical supply to your business, you're probably going to spend a lot more time evaluating to make sure that that supplier is going to fit your business. If, however, on the Kraljic matrix, it's something that is kind of the bottom left corner, it's repeat business, it's quite standard, it's quite low value, and it's not really strategic, you might spend a bit less time doing the evaluation. So things that are going to be considered, you could also use your Carter's 10Cs to think about how you're going to evaluate. But the things that generally in my career I would think about, financial stability is a really big one. So there's been lots of things in the press recently talking about when contracts have been put in place and the supplier has actually gone out of business. I think the biggest one I can think of is Carillion, which affected massive amounts of companies up and down the UK. So it's not just about checking those suppliers out financially when you first put the contract in place, but it's also really important to keep checking that financial stability as that supplier has been one of your suppliers for a period of time. Depending on the procurement, size or capacity of the supplier is also really important. So if you've got a contract that you're thinking of placing for, I don't know, £20 million, and the supplier only turns over £2 million a year, it's obviously going to be a big stretch for them to be able to fulfill that contract. So you've got to think about the size and the capacity of the supplier. Thinking back to my automotive days, but also my current healthcare days, quality is really important, and so is reputation. So if you have a supplier that is able to provide a product, you need to know that that product is going to be of certain quality. So in the healthcare sector, for example, they have to meet certain requirements and pass certain trials. So we all know about the COVID situation at the moment, all the vaccines that are going through the trials. Once those have been evaluated and are deemed to be safe, then they'll get licensed, and then those are going to be available. That happens quite widely in pharmaceutical products. So there may be a kind of quality or a licensing requirement.
Yeah.
Experience and knowledge as well. So you want to know that if you're going to contract with a supplier, that they're going to have the experience that you need. After all, you're going to be paying for this product or this service. You need to know that they're going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
The other thing that people sometimes forget about is the kind of ethical, cultural and sustainability part of suppliers. So sometimes you'll get a supplier that perhaps won't be as ethical as you would like them to be. So if you work for an organisation that has really high standards with sustainability, with ethics, and you're perhaps looking to work with a company whose kind of cultural fit doesn't match that, generally speaking, that's never going to work because the two companies are not going to gel. So there's lots of different considerations that you can think about when you're looking to evaluate a supplier, and it really depends on the spend and what it is you're going to be buying and how long you want to put that contract in place for.
That's brilliant, Sharron, really informative. Thank you very much. So based on all your years of experience within public and private sector, do you think you could share with us one example of an actual supplier evaluation process and just talk us briefly through what you did and why you made the decisions you did, please?
Yeah, so I've chosen an example that actually comes from private sector.
Okay.
And it's something I did a number of years ago whilst I worked in the automotive industry, and it was a really big tender looking at returnable packaging. So in the organisation I worked for, it was a Japanese automotive organisation. They worked on a just-in-time basis, which meant all of the parts for the cars that we made came to the factory literally just before it was needed to be put onto the car.
Yeah.
And the way that they used to do this was they supplied to the suppliers the returnable packaging, which had all the inserts in. They would put the parts in, that would get collected or sent to site in that packaging, and it used to sit by the line and people would take the parts out and put them on the vehicles. The logistics team had decided that the current sizes of the returnable packaging we were using wasn't optimal for the size of the lorry, and they had looked at this and decided that they could get 100% cross stackability of boxes by tweaking the sizes of the packaging. The problem was that would mean it wasn't a standard product on the market, so we were looking to create, if you like, a whole new line of packaging with a whole new set of sizes that would fit standard lorries and be able to fill it 100%, so we were not shipping fresh air. The saving in logistics terms was huge. It was upwards of £50 million a year, so that we weren't shipping fresh air. So massive project.
Yeah.
So what did we do in terms of supplier evaluation? Well, the first thing we did was put a project team together and get the specification and requirements. So if you're talking about a big spend and a big project, it's really, really good to get a project team together so that you can really nail the specification and the requirements. If you don't get that part right, my experience tells me that you will struggle and you'll put a contract in place that will never work. So that part's really, really important.
Yeah, yeah.
In order to get the right suppliers onto the tender process, we did huge amounts of market research from the procurement team. We went to trade fairs. We also did a pre-qualification questionnaire. So because this project was so big, we needed suppliers of a certain size, certain turnover. As I talked about earlier, we needed them to have the right cultural fit, the right sustainability, because that was very big in the organisation that I worked for at the time.
Mm-hmm.
We needed them to have the quality, we needed them to have the experience and the knowledge. So we came up with a pre-qualification questionnaire. I think we sent the tender out eventually to 5 different suppliers. Things that we were looking at were capacity, whole life costing, so really interested in how we were able to design the packaging, talking about different tooling. Would we actually be able to kind of set design for this and look at intellectual property rights so that we get royalties if they decided as a company to sell this to somebody else. We then generate some income. So there's a lot of different facets to this procurement. We were interested in their experience, obviously their finance, locations as well, because we were looking at this for the whole of Europe. So we didn't just want a UK position, we wanted to be able to send these boxes all over the continent. And also innovation. So we sent the tender out, having done the specification with the team. 5 companies bid for it. We then did an evaluation. So we formed an evaluation panel. Before we got the tenders back, we sorted the weightings in advance with all the questions and the evaluation that we were going to carry out. We documented the scores. Everybody had to evaluate separately first and document those scores, and then we all came together as a team and we looked at all the averages. Then we shortlisted 2 companies. We went and did site visits, we carried out audits, we held the negotiations, and then ultimately we decided on one supplier that met all of those requirements. And to my knowledge, they still supply kind of 10 years later in the organisation, and that packaging is still going. And they've earned revenue from royalties because they've sold it to other companies as well.
Amazing. So that's testament really to the fact that a real stringent evaluation process really does pay dividends, in the fact that the company's still gaining value sort of 10 years plus on since you actually conducted the initial activity.
Absolutely. And it does, I know that's a huge amount of resource because the project team was made up of lots of different people from the organisation, but again, going back to the Qualjit matrix, it was in that top right category. It was a very strategic procurement. It meant a lot to the business. It hit lots of different areas. So it was worth the time we spent on it.
Absolutely. And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit now, Sharron, and I appreciate that you've spoken about all the things that are important with evaluation. But do you think there's any areas that are more important than others with regards to evaluation? And if so, why do you think that?
So I think it very much depends on what it is you're buying. So you can imagine if you're buying a building, for example. So in the role that I'm doing at the moment, it's public sector, it's healthcare. We have got huge amounts of capital programs going on. So the requirements that we have from the suppliers are very different at this point in time for what we're buying than they would be for something standard. So at the moment, it's all about capacity, it's all about timescales, it's all about resource, and it's all about quality. And those are the things that are really key to us. Obviously, we also need the supply to be financially stable, and that's proving quite difficult in the current climate because a lot of companies are struggling. However, we're generally finding in the kind of building area that lots of companies are still quite busy, they're financially stable, they're able to keep going in all of the lockdowns. So that isn't such a big issue for us. But again, it really depends on what you're buying. If you're buying stationery products, you're not going to need such a big evaluation because so many different suppliers on the market. You don't need to carry out that full evaluation process.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thank you. And finally, one last question. In your opinion, based on your professional experience, what one piece of advice could you give to the listeners of this podcast which you think will assist them with conducting effective supplier evaluation?
So my one piece of advice would be, as a procurement team, in conjunction with your stakeholders, is to evaluate your evaluation process and really create templates. So if you get your stakeholders from the different parts of the business to buy into this process and you kind of have a brainstorming session, you can create standard operating procedures that you can hold as part of procurement, and you can roll this out time and time again. It can be a proven process and you can tweak it as you go along. So if you carry out a procurement and you think, oh, do you know what? Actually, we need to tweak something or we need to add something in, then it can be a live document that changes. But generally speaking, if you have templates, tenders, you have your terms and conditions that you can put in there, you can have different things that you can include. So whole life costing, if you're talking about capital equipment, you can have a section that you can pop in there if it's relevant. and basically hold those documents as part of procurement, create them, get them right, revisit them regularly, and they will provide an invaluable source of information for you on every tender that you carry out.
Fantastic advice there, Sharron, and certainly showing the experience that you've built up over the years in that little nugget there. So thank you very much indeed.
The other thing that I would also recommend is doing some kind of evaluator training for the panels. So we often sit on evaluations, and as procurement teams, we're quite used to it. However, a lot of the time, if you're running a project for a tender, you might get somebody from the stakeholder department that you're working with that doesn't do this very often. And generally, they're not always that confident, or they don't really know about how to do it. So one thing that we've just been looking at introducing where I work currently in the NHS is procurement leading evaluation training for evaluation panel members, because it's really important in the public sector that when you're evaluating tenders, it's thoroughly documented and it can be scrutinised and you've recorded absolutely everything. And I think that was a bit lacking before. So it's something we've introduced, and that's made a massive difference.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Excellent advice again. Really useful. Thank you. And I'm sure the listeners will take a lot from that as well. So I just want to say thank you very much for your time. I know you're a very busy lady. I know that you've taken time out of your schedule to do this for us and the knowledge team today. So thank you very much indeed. Hopefully the listeners will find it as interesting as I have. Always enjoy doing these, and I learn a lot as well. But sincere thanks, Sharron, for your time and for sharing your examples and your knowledge. Thank you very much indeed.
No problem. It was a pleasure. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.